You are not alone. Your child will be remembered. Your child mattered. Your grief matters, and it has a space.
This is NICU Babies Parent Support with Kathryn Whitaker, a podcast from Hand to Hold, a national nonprofit that provides free personalized support, resources, and community before, during, and after a NICU stay. My conversations here focus on education and personal stories with medical and hospital professionals, counselors, therapists, and NICU moms and dads from across the country. So whether you're preparing for a NICU stay, you're currently there, or you're months and years past your stay, you belong here. The NICU is hard. We're here to help. I'm your host, Kathryn Whitaker, the mom of 6 children, including my very own NICU baby, and I'm so grateful that you're here. Well, howdy, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Last time that y'all tuned in, you heard a beautiful, tender story of loss. As a warning, next time that the podcast airs, you will also hear a different family, a different loss, but still grief nonetheless. And in between those two really tender, beautiful stories, personal stories, I felt like it was important to have someone speak into grief and loss. And this is her day job. This is what she does. She helps families and children navigate through loss. It is a tender conversation. If you are ready to listen to it, I hope that you do. If you are not quite ready, it's okay. Hit pause and we'll see you on the next episode. But Dr. Leigh really has an important job of helping people navigate through grief. And many times I think we give a lot of press to the adults in the room. How is that mom? How is that dad? How are those adults dealing with the loss of a child or someone that they love? And we sometimes forget about the kids in the room, that they also are processing grief. They are also processing loss, maybe just in a very different way than the adults in the room. And Dr. Leigh's life work has really been focused on child life and then thanatology and then teaching others how to help families navigate through grief. And we have a really beautiful conversation ahead. I will say that in our conversation, we talk about a lot of things, but Dr. Leigh shares many amazing resources that you can use if you are a family member who's helping a child navigate loss, or maybe you're just having a hard time yourself. She gives a treasure, I call it the treasure trove of resources. So make sure that you listen for the whole podcast because there's some great things in there. So my guest today is Dr. Korie Leigh. She is a published author, university professor, child life specialist, and a grief counselor. She has spent 20 years working with children and families experiencing grief and loss. As an associate professor and program director of the thanatology program at Marian University, she teaches graduate courses on child development, death, dying, and bereavement. Dr. Leigh obtained her PhD in transpersonal psychology, where she wrote her dissertation on the lived experiences of bereaved parents. And with that, let's have a really tender conversation. Well, I'm excited to have a professional in the room. Dr. Leigh, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
We have a really, I think, tender and important topic today. And so I'm excited to have a conversation with you. I know that sometimes it always helps listeners to know what your background is. I know I gave them your big fancy bio earlier, but what led you to pursue a career in child life? And also, I want to make sure that I say it right, thanatology, and we'll probably define that so that people know what we're talking about. But what led you there? And then what helped you get to the specific way in which you serve families and children?
Yeah, absolutely. And you said that correctly. It is
Oh, good, 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 good.
thanatology. So I the path that I took to becoming a child life specialist was fairly straightforward. I knew at a young age that I wanted to work in a hospital setting with children. And at the time, I didn't know what child life was. And the quickest way to that profession was through music therapy. So I actually started out pursuing a career in music therapy. And then I found out about child life, and it was like the light bulb just went off for me. And I was lucky enough to find out about this when I was doing my undergrad. So my bachelor's is in child development and child life, and I started working with hospitalized children and families, even before I graduated with my bachelor's through internships and practicums. And I very, very quickly realized that the specialization within child life, the area of focus, that I was not only passionate about, but I just kept coming back to over and over was in palliative and hospice care. So I tended to work in ICU settings, hematology, oncology, children that had quite medically complex conditions. And then that kind of led me to the path of thanatology, which led me to the path of integral and transpersonal psychology, which led me to the path of teaching and research. And it's a very long, kind of convoluted pathway, but everything led from one thing to the next.
What the doors just kept opening to the next place and the next place and the next place. So, did you play an instrument?
Yeah, yeah. So I played my in music therapy. You need to essentially specialize in two instruments. My voice was my primary instrument, and then guitar was my secondary.
Well, if I'd known, I would have had you pull out the guitar. We could have done I could have done a little bit of that. I bet it was I mean, I think the best ways in which we serve people, whether it's in the medical profession or things that we do, is that we're led to the next place organically because I think it becomes this real discernment period where you're like, okay, now I'm going to serve in this way and I'm going to take the things that I learned here and now I'm going to use them in this place. So I love that it's been this beautiful sort of transition into where you are today. I was looking, Dr. Lee, at your website, and there was something on there that struck me. You said, "I can't fix the pain that you're experiencing, but I can help you learn how to navigate through it." And I really, really love that. So, why don't you give people an idea of some ways in which you accompany people as they're learning to navigate through this grief? Whether it could be the loss of a child, it could be stillbirth, miscarriage, termination. There are lots of ways in which we experience grief and loss. And so I'd be curious for you to share a little bit about what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad that you picked up on that. The concept of navigating and being a guide is something that is at the focal point of my practice, my clinical work, my academic work, particularly as it relates to grief. Grief and grieving, the pain, the experience of that is a fundamentally human experience. There's nothing pathological about it when it comes to the expression of our emotion. However, within the context that we live in, our society, our culture, our family, sometimes our religion, different pressures are put upon people to make them feel as if there is a certain way to grieve, or as a helper, or as I call myself as a guide, that I somehow need to fix other people's pain. That pain is something to be fixed. And certainly, we don't want to experience pain and we don't want to be grieving in these really deep and profound ways, but they happen. And instead of trying to fix it, we can understand it. And it's the same kind of premise that I use when working with children. If we can take a really kind of scary, complicated, and layered topic and shed light on it, break it down into really simple terms, we can understand it. And if we can understand something, we can meet it, we can engage with it,
Yeah.
we can learn how it shows up in our life. And so as I navigate this pathway with our families, I work differently with every family because every family and every person presents with unique challenges within their grief. Sometimes people really want information. And because we're very steeped in the stage-based grief model, I teach academic courses at the graduate level on grief theory and bereavement. And actually, just yesterday, I taught a course it was a crash course on 27. Yes, you heard that right. 27 different grief theories. So we have
Wow.
moved so far beyond the concept that grief is linear or stage or phase or even task based. So it can be helpful to sometimes just talk and help kind of break down the scholarly jargon for the clients that I work with to be like, here's what people think about grief. Like, what is that like for you? What resonates with you? And for other people, they really need a space and they need a witness. In our grief, we need it to be witnessed. We're not meant to be grieving in isolation, but that's kind of the byproduct of our culture and society of now, right? Like we are doing a lot of things in isolation, and grieving is meant to be shared collectively. And sometimes the space that I create is that collective.
I love how you said that grief needs a witness because it sometimes feels like when people are grieving, we're like, "Oh, don't talk about that." Or like or if they start to cry, we immediately take our I mean, I was guilty of that, I think, before we experienced loss, is that I just it made me uncomfortable, and I didn't wanna and I thought, "Well, if I mention it to them, then it makes them sad or uncomfortable," and we just no one was talking about it, but yet, like you said, it's this universal, none of us will escape life without having lose whether we lose one person or multiple people, it's the unifying part of our humanness. So I think this grief needs a witness, I think is that also needs an amen from the back. Like I think there's some really important parts of that grieving process. So Dr. Lee, when a family is experiencing the greatest loss and they feel like they are underwater and they can barely function, where do you start with them? What is it that you do when you talk about grief needing a witness? How do you help them navigate through some of those early days? And then as those days become weeks and then the weeks become months, what does that look like?
Yeah, and those first days and weeks and months are arguably the lowest, hardest,
Mhm.
most painful and foggy. I know when I experienced my loss, the first month of my grief, when I look back on it, I don't remember much. I
Right.
know that I did my work and I clearly did a good job because my students gave me some good feedback on my course, but like I don't remember that. So sometimes families and people really need like that witness space, someone to mirror back to them that what you're feeling is valid and that it is normal to not want to get out of bed in those first few days. It is normal to feel grief in your body, all of these
Mm.
things that you're experiencing. So sometimes just having the space to verbalize, validate, and acknowledge it is as hard as it feels. And this will never be a space where I'll say, oh, like, well, at least, right? We all know those people that
Oh,
are like, well, at least it wasn't this, or you can look forward to that. We don't need that when we're grieving. We need to feel safe and held to express grief how it's showing up. And sometimes, especially in a family, a partnership, any kind of like relational dynamic, people are grieving together, but they're also grieving alone.
right.
And so when you have that kind of intersecting grief and you have different grieving styles, that can cause communication challenges, conflicts can come up, resentments can start brewing on an already really, really challenging kind of emotional space that the couple and the family is navigating. So when I start working with somebody, I am fairly flexible also with the frequency. Like I've worked with many people that they've needed to see me a few times a week for that first few weeks. And I can do that. Sometimes people need 15-minute phone calls because they can't do a full 50-minute session. I can do that, right? Like being flexible within grief and grieving, especially in those first few days and weeks, is really important. So that's one of the things that makes my style a little different. Is I will text, we can email, we can FaceTime, we can just talk on the phone. It doesn't have to be this sit down because there are changes happening in the brain also that occur in these first few days and weeks of grief, which a lot of people are not aware of. So I do a lot of psychoeducation as well on like, here's what is normal, even if it doesn't feel normal. And here's kind of, a general timeline. I certainly don't say like you're going to feel better at 6 weeks or 8 weeks,
Right.
but some of like the brain fog and the physical symptoms, or even like clumsiness, our vestibular part of the brain is impacted by grief. So like you'll run into things, you'll trip and fall and be like, oh, where did I place my keys? So sometimes just like that information in the beginning is so validating and it helps to take the pressure off from, am I grieving the right way?
Right. As if there's a right way to grieve.
Yeah.
You know, I think there's a lot of I think emphasis that's given we'll use the example of a family who's lost a child. There's a lot of emphasis given to the mom and the dad or the family, the adults in the room, but sometimes we forget about the kids in the room and how they deal with grief. So as you start thinking about, Dr. Lee, how you serve your adults, what does it look like when you're serving your patients who are younger, who may not, I guess, may not have the bandwidth or maybe even the ability, the cognizant ability to be like, you know what, I think that that's unhealthy, or I think that's hard because they don't have a way to verbalize what it is they feel. What does it look like if you're the kid in the room who's grieving a loss?
Yeah, yeah, and when I work with children, it's also very flexible. Like some kids can stay the whole 50 minutes and be super engaged, and others they're tapped out at 15 or 20 minutes. I like to be able to kind of read the energy of the room, and inherently as a child life specialist, I use play. I use the expressive arts and the work that I do with kids. Bibliotherapy is a really big tool that I use with grief and grieving. So, reading a book with a character or a storyline that mirrors what the child is going through, especially if it's a child that is a little less open to talking directly. Some kids, they'll just go there. They're like, yep, my sister died and I feel sad. And I'm like, your sister died and you feel sad. Okay. And then we can start from that place. And then
Yeah.
other kids, it takes them a little time to warm up. And so being able to read where the child is, and it's like with anyone I work with, I meet them where they're at. Everybody is on a different trajectory in terms of
Yeah.
their ability to like metabolize the grief, to process it, and to learn new coping strategies. And at the end of the day, that's really kind of a secondary focus that I have with everyone that I work with is we can all use more tools in our tool belt.
Yeah.
And oftentimes when a grief of this magnitude occurs, prior coping skills fail. They don't work anymore, or they're not as efficient. And so sometimes it can just be helpful to find different strategies to get us through those really hard times. So I do that same thing with children. And when you're working with kids, it's never just a child in and of themselves, it's the whole family, right? So I will oftentimes, have follow-up sessions with the parents or the primary caregivers, providing, a bit of insight and some psychoeducation as to behaviorally, like what's normal and what to look out for, and how do you navigate it when your child has a grief burst, or when there are certain times of the day that are really hard, or when new fears pop up.
Do you find, Dr. Lee, like if a family's experiencing a loss that, like, do you think it's a non-negotiable that they should put their children in counseling or at least have someone talk through with their kids what they're feeling, what they're going through? I know for some families, maybe those resources are available. I know, like in Austin, for example, we have a nonprofit called the Christie Center, and so they focus on grief counseling, and it's free. So some communities have things like that, and some don't. But I'm curious what I guess your suggestion would be to a family who's experienced a loss. How do you know if your child would be a good candidate for grief therapy? Should you wait? Like, what are some things that parents might look for to say, like, I think we need someone to step in here because maybe they're dealing so much with their own grief that
Yeah.
to deal with how their kids processing it may be the breaking point, like, that might be too much.
Absolutely. And it is different for every family in every community, and every developmental stage has different kind of behavioral cues. Like from a broad perspective, I do not see any harm, and the literature doesn't provide any insight into it being a negative or limiting, to have children engaging in a developmentally appropriate space where they are learning coping techniques that they can apply not just to their grief and grieving, but other stressful experiences, and be with other kids that have experienced a loss. So, places like I live here in Santa Fe, like Gerard's house or the New Mexico Children's Grief Center, Aaron's Place, the Dougie Center, these community organizations that offer free, usually free support. I think it's the first place to start. If
Yeah,
you're lucky enough to live somewhere and that you have the access and resources to get there. A
right.
secondary is that I firmly believe that every parent has the capacity and potential to navigate their grief with their children. But parents need help. You need guidance. You need,
Yeah,
resources that are appropriate. books that are appropriate to read with your child. And I'm sure we'll get to this later, but that's one of the reasons that I wrote my book, is that it is literally a step-by-step guide for how to have these conversations, with a developmental chart in the back on what to look for and red flags and when to reach out for help. We need to empower our families to be able to navigate these experiences together. And sometimes, I've also met with families once, like a loss has happened. Parents are like, I don't know what to say, or what book do I read, or how do I explain this? My child keeps asking this question and I don't know what to do. So sometimes just like one session with me can give families enough resources and empowerment to move forward with continuing these conversations. But to the follow-up question of like, when should parents reach out? Parents fundamentally know their children the best. And if they have a gut feeling, if they're concerned at all, reach out.
Yeah.
There's no harm in that.
What about the parent, Dr. Leigh, that I'll use a personal example, is that when my dad died, I think initially I was worried about sharing that grief with my kids. Like, is it going to be too overwhelming? So I think there might be a parent out there that says, yes, I know that I'm going through my grief, but like, I don't want to scare my kid, or I want to make sure that I'm showing them healthy ways. Like, I think it's okay for my kids to see me cry. It's okay for us to bring
Mhm.
up something, and it's okay to laugh, because I think sometimes we fear like, if we're laughing, is that okay? So how do you, or I guess what would be your advice to a parent who's like, man, I want to show my kids the reality of grief, but I don't want to overwhelm them with, something that I might be going through too.
Yeah, yeah, and that is it's a very challenging space to be, right?
Yeah.
Because certainly with the intensity of grief, we know that there can be hours of just crying, sobbing, like just not being able to communicate.
Right.
But we also know that we get through those. And then there's kind of like the rest of the day of grieving, right? And within the rest of the day of grieving, there might be some tears, there might be moments of sadness, there might be moments of reminiscing. And one of the most powerful things that parents can do is help to model for their kids healthy emotional expression. It is healthy to feel sad and to
Right.
cry and to be angry. And what we do with those feelings and how we feel them in our bodies, how we express them outwardly, children pick up on that from their families. Oftentimes, kids will try and protect their parents. And so they'll be the ones that don't want to talk about it because they're afraid that they'll make you upset.
Right.
And so then everyone starts dancing around this metaphorical pink elephant in the room, not having the opportunity to talk openly and share openly about their emotions. And I feel a really good place to start, and I recommend this for all families I work with, no matter what they're coming to me with, is to get an emotion chart. And you can literally print them out on Google Image, just put like feelings, faces, or emotion chart. And it has, anywhere from like 6 to 20 different feelings, and laminate that or print it out in colors, stick it on your refrigerator, and use that as a check in periodically throughout the day. Not just when things are sad or scary, but when things are happy or silly or there's anticipation. So you're starting to label the emotions with the feelings that you're having in the body as a family. And then it just becomes a part of like the family vocabulary of talking openly about emotions. That's kind of the first step of the process.
I really love that. Where were you 6 kids ago? I love that. That's great advice. This podcast is produced by Hand to Hold, a national nonprofit, but we're more than simply a podcast. Be sure to download our app in the Apple Store or on Google Play, or you can visit our website to discover all the ways that we can support you as a NICU parent at handtohold.org. You can join one of our support groups, sign up for counseling, find loss and bereavement support, request a peer mentor, or check out our educational resources and family stories. And all of that is at no cost to you. So what would be If you're a parent and there's been a loss in your home, what would be like normal reactions to grief that you might see your kids exhibiting? You would look at that and say that is normal. Or what would you look at and say like, "Oh, that's concerning. I think we need someone to come help." What would be sort of the things that you're looking for, both healthy and unhealthy?
Yeah, and so I had mentioned a little while ago that everything is developmentally based, right? So what's appropriate for a toddler might not be for a school age, might not be for an adolescent. In general, just for the sake of the time that we have today, in general, not just with grief, but with major life stressors, you can expect a little bit of developmental regression. And so, what that can look like is for a very young child, maybe they were just potty trained, like they're just out of diapers, we're celebrating that success. Then something really sudden and big and scary happens. It is normal to see behavioral and developmental regression. So, maybe that child is back to using diapers. Maybe they just transitioned to a big kid bed and now they want to sleep in your bed. Maybe you finally wean them off from binkies and now they're sucking their thumb again. Those things are normal and expected within a time frame. And here's the challenge is everyone is different. Every child's temperament is different. Their attachment style is different. Family dynamics are different. So for some kids, that regression might last a week. It might last a few weeks for other kids. If the regression lasts months, that's something to be mindful of and maybe, seek some additional support and help. And it's also one of those aspects of it. If it's starting to significantly impact your child's quality of life, meaning they're losing sleep, they're not able, like maybe they were able to like shower and get dressed and brush their teeth and like be kind of self-sufficient, and now they're not able to do that for weeks consecutively, not like a day here or a day there, or it's hard to get them out the door, but for an extended period of time and that is outside of the norm, that's something to reach out for. Nightmares are normal. Sleep regression is normal, both sleeping too much and not sleeping enough. Particularly nighttime tends to be a more activated time for kids and their fears and their worries. It is normal for kids, especially if there has been a parental loss, to worry about the safety of themselves, safety of the surviving parent, safety of a sibling. It's also very common to notice new themes emerging in play. So, for example, if your child is still symbolically playing or doing any kind of like make believe play, notice, and this might be very apparent, or you might have to kind of watch a little bit for themes of losing and finding something, burying items, rescuing items, sometimes explicitly. And I've seen this oftentimes, kids will play cemetery, they'll play funeral, they'll play death. And this is how a child, particularly those that are pre-operational, so particularly for kids under the age of 8, this is how they are processing and making sense of something that's really big and hard to understand. So they will do that through their play. And there will also be repetition in that play as well. I could keep going. But I think those are kind of like the big ones.
Particularly as you're thinking about cognitively, what can they process? I mean, it makes sense that some of those things are how they process, whereas we might process with a good friend that's maybe been through something similar and talk it out, and it feels like we're having the same conversation over and over. It makes sense that kids would do the same. So tell us about your book because I think it's an exceptional resource. There are, I will say, not as many resources as I had hoped there would be about walking kids through grief. So I'm really grateful for your book. So why don't you tell people about that?
Yeah, thank you. My book is called What Does Grief Feel Like? And it was written really out of that same frustration, which was I was working clinically with a lot of grieving kids. And I would be so excited when a new book would come out. I would go get it. And it wouldn't be clinically appropriate. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of really beautiful books out there about death or dying or grief, But from a child development perspective, it's really important that we're using appropriate, accurate terminology, that books avoid euphemisms, that when you're talking about death, the words dead or die or death are in the book, that we don't use ambiguous terms to talk about something that's already very ambiguous. So, right away, most of the books I was looking at did not have that. And if they did, the illustrations weren't on par. So sometimes they might be like a little scary from my clinical opinion. And so what I would end up doing is I would like tape pages together. I would take pages out of books. I would like write my own books with kids. And then I realized, I'm just going to have to write a book. And so the book is psychotherapeutic. And what that really means is that it's not a storybook necessarily meant to be just given to a child and that they read themselves. It's meant to be facilitated. Ideally, a parent could do this, a caregiver could do this, a teacher, a counselor, a therapist, anybody really can take this book and read along with the child. There are questions that are embedded throughout the story to help facilitate that conversation. And as a side note, each of those questions that are embedded are questions that I ask children. They're taken right from my practice and they are all open ended. They help to provide context. And for parents that are like, I don't know how to have this conversation,
Yeah.
it gives you the script to start. And then in the back of the book, as I had mentioned previously, there is a developmental chart which breaks down infants all the way to adolescents in terms of what to look for, what's within the scope of normal grief reactions. There is a little script on how to talk about death and how that conversation can be facilitated. And there are a few guided activities also in the back of the book as well.
I can't think of a more perfect person to write a book about that than someone who is trained in what you're trained in, but also has a background in child life and making sure that we speak to our kids openly and honestly, but also developmentally appropriate so that then we begin to set up good, healthy characteristics of how you grieve, but also how you talk about grief and how you talk about loss. Because I keep thinking like those kids in 10 or 15 or 20 years when they look back on that will have, I think, a much more healthy perspective of death because we've laid the groundwork for what that can mean and how we talk about it. So I know that there are some other great resources out there. Dr. Leigh, what would be whether it's books or other things that you think social media accounts that you think might be helpful for a family who's navigating loss and trying to help their kids also navigate loss?
Yeah, so 100% the National Alliance of Children's Grief is a fantastic resource. It's chock full of information. There are booklets and pamphlets. There's a state by state breakout for like at the beginning of this podcast when we were talking about, organizations that provide free grief support. They have a whole map of the country and you can click on your state, you can see the providers, you can see the organizations.
Seriously.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's
that's
it's
awesome. Okay.
amazing. It's so incredible. If you're a provider or a clinician, there's also a lot of education, continuing education opportunities. There's a yearly conference this year is in Denver in June. So that's a really wonderful resource. Also, Dougie Center is my go-to. Their materials, their social media, they have podcasts and webinars. They are like the forefront of the intersection of clinical practice and research. So they also partner with Judy's House. I think it's Judy's House in Denver. And Judy's House also has fantastic website, lots of resources. But what they're doing, which is pivotal to the child bereavement population, is they conduct yearly statistical analyses on the amount of bereaved children that are in this country. And they break it down by state. You can break it down by county. So if you are a provider or if you need statistics, if you need some like really recent research on the implications for childhood bereavement, how many kids are in your state that are bereaved, Judy's House is the place to go.
I love that that resource exists. I mean, I know it exists in our own local community, but sometimes maybe you don't live near a big city or maybe you don't live near, where some of these are. That gives you a good idea of where is it available, but also resources that you might be able to use that are online as well. And we have lots of families in our own personal community who've dealt with loss, whether it's a family member, a parent, or whether it's been a sibling or a child. And I know that that's the number one question that we get asked all the time is, where are some good resources that I can use with my kids so that we can do this together instead of me working on myself and then what happens to my kids. So I love that that's out there. I'm going to ask, I don't know if this is an easy question, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it anyway. How do we get comfortable with inviting grief into the room, Dr. Lee?
Mm. So, that whole idea of building the muscle of being comfortable with the uncomfortable is a lifelong journey. We have to start with where we're at. And it reminds me of someone I was working with recently who was very early in her grief and really struggling with those moments of despair, those moments of, I am in that pit. There is no ladder. There is no light. How am I ever going to get out? And we played around with this idea. And in the work that I do, everything's a suggestion. It's like, think about it as a thought experiment, is kind of how I approach it. I'm like, we'll experiment with this. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. But what I had her do for the next week was to set a timer for 5 minutes when she felt like she was in that pit of despair. Check in with herself after the timer was up. Where was she at? Was she still there? Was she halfway out? Was she already out? And over time of just setting the 5 minutes to be in it, to feel it, and then to notice what changed within that 5 minutes of time helped her to be able to slowly and gradually move through those really dark times without sitting in it for a long period of time, if that makes sense.
It does.
So being able to bring awareness, notice, and develop that muscle over time helps us to be able to sit in these really hard and dark spaces. Oftentimes, when I tell people what I do, I have like 5 scripts because like I do like it's complicated. And if you're at like an event or something and we're like, oh, what do you do? And I'm like, oh, well, I'm not an accountant.
Right.
The number one response I get is that must be so hard, or I could never do that. And it is hard, and it was harder when I first started because I didn't have that muscle. I hadn't learned how to use it. I didn't know when it was getting fatigued. I wasn't sure how to nurture it. And now, 20 years later, it's still hard. I still have moments where my heart is just so hurting for the people I work with, but I can tend to it now. I can nurture it. And that allows me to continue to do this work. And the same goes for those that are in those experiences, that it's like building a new muscle, right? We don't like deadlift 500 pounds, never doing CrossFit. We start with like a 3 pounder and then we work our way up.
That was really beautifully said. I know there might be people listening to this, Dr. Lee, that maybe their family is not the one experiencing the loss, but someone that they love is, and they want to help them and they don't know what to do. What would be your best encouragement to someone who's maybe just stepped out of that loss, but yet wants to be a helper? What are some things that are helpful to someone who is grieving, and what are some things that are maybe not helpful?
So I want to give you a resource. Megan Devine, I believe she
I love
wrote,
her. She's amazing.
yeah, It's Okay That
Yes.
You're Not Okay. She
Yes.
has one of the best like visual like infographics that answers this exact question. There's like on the right side, there's do this for your grieving person, don't do this for your grieving person. And it is fairly universal. And really, what it comes down to is just like you're building that muscle we were talking about, as a helper, we also need to build that muscle because it is inherent in us to fix. We want to
Yes.
fix, and grief can't be fixed.
Mm.
And so it's paramount for the helper or for the bystander to understand their relationship to grief, understand their own relationship to what makes them uncomfortable. Because if they're uncomfortable talking openly about it, the griever that they're trying to help is going to pick up on that,
Yeah.
just like kids do as well. So that's a good place to start from, is just recognizing your own grief loss history and like where you're at with that. The other thing, and this is more universal than anything, is to acknowledge the loss has happened. So many times, the people I work with say, in the first few weeks that people were dropping off food, we had so many casseroles, I had so many phone calls. And then after the second week, they just stopped. And people don't say his name, they don't ask about him, they don't bring him up. Bring up the person, ask about how they're grieving, what their grief is like today. Where's your grief at today?
Think it was Megan. Yeah, I think that we'll make sure that we link that to the show notes because I think that's a great resource. I think it was something that she said recently is when someone shares that someone that they've loved has died. She said the question that she asked them is, what was your favorite thing
Mhm.
about them? Or tell me about them. It's sort of an invitation that you see their loss and that you're inviting them to talk about
Yeah.
their person, which I thought it sounds so simple, but I think means a lot to someone that you don't just say, "Oh, I'm so sorry," and then you immediately change the subject because you're uncomfortable.
Yeah, exactly. And to follow up with that, like that's a really beautiful invitation for those that were able to develop a relationship with the person who died. But if we're talking about pregnancy loss, stillbirth,
Right.
termination, that kind of question wouldn't necessarily be able to be answered. One of the questions that I encourage people to ask is, did you name your baby?
Mm.
What was your baby's name? Would you be okay if I said their name? And remember their name and say their name if that's what the parent wants. That's the second most common thing that I hear bereaved parents talk about is they don't hear their child's name anymore, or they never got to hear their name. So
Right.
hearing their name is a way in which they can remember, carry that legacy. The final thing that I'll say, because this is really common across like all kind of grief loss experiences, is people will, with good intentions, say, "Oh, well, what do you need?" or "How can I help you?"
Right.
Right? And oftentimes the griever doesn't know what they need. They
Mm.
don't they don't know how you can help. So sometimes you have to take a little initiative and be like, I'm gonna clean your house on Thursday. Go take a nap. Like if you have that kind of relationship with them, right? Or I'm gonna this week I'm gonna take care of dinners. Just tell me what your dietary restrictions are and just don't worry about it and it'll be delivered. Just take initiative if you have that kind of relationship, because oftentimes like you don't know what you need from moment to moment, and having so many people ask you what do you need or how can I help can just be very overwhelming.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I have so many questions for you, but I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure I'm mindful of that. Dr. Lee, if there's someone listening to this and they've experienced what I call the greatest loss, the loss of a child, what do you want them to hear?
You are not alone. Your child will be remembered. Your child mattered. Your grief matters, and it has a space. And if you feel like you don't have a space for your grief, reach out and we will create that together.
Dr. Lee, thank you for so many bits of wisdom, but also for so many pieces of resources for parents who are helping not only themselves, but their children navigate loss. It is a topic that needs more people to witness it. And I'm grateful that we took some time today to do just that. So thank you. Well, in today's 2 minute take, I'm not sure there is much more than I can add. Except to say this and maybe say it again, maybe with a little bit more gusto, is that grief needs a witness. I'm so grateful that Dr. Lee mentioned that and it just kept coming up in our conversation. It wasn't planned, but this focus, this ability to give it space, a presence, and a witness, and that what you're feeling is valid, what you're feeling is normal, and grief is hard. Bottom line, grief is hard. There's no 10-point checklist that you can go through and just it magically gets better. But I do think that many of the resources that she shared are good tools for all of us, really, because no one escapes life without losing someone that they love. But also I think this turning our heads toward the children in the room, and also recognizing that we have the ability as the adults in the room, that we have the ability to help our kids learn how to cope with grief in good and healthy ways, that it's possible to do that. And I think it's wonderful that she mentioned again that grief is not about, this podcast today wasn't about me or Dr. Leigh really helping you fix your grief. It was about helping you feel seen in your grief. I hope that you feel seen in that, because actually, after we finished recording, we started talking more and more about this NICU experience leaves us all grieving something. Some of us are grieving the greatest loss, and that's a loss of a child. And then some of us are grieving a pregnancy that we lost, or a medical diagnosis that we thought we weren't going to get, but instead we did. And that there's all sorts of different kinds of grief, and Inside Out, when she rolls in with the baggages and it's anxiety, and she's like, we're all here, that there are many suitcases of grief that a NICU family carries. And so after Dr. Leigh and I finished talking on the podcast and recording, I said, you know what? I actually have so many more questions. So please, can I have you back? And we're going to talk about all sorts of different kinds of loss and grief. But for today's episode, I hope that it made you feel seen where you are today, but that we left you not just feeling seen, but that we left you feeling seen, and also hear so many ways in which you can find support and resources to help you get to the next place. So next time, we will be talking a little bit more about grief, this time with a different story, but valid nonetheless. And I'm so excited to have you back. If you have enjoyed today's podcast episode, please give us a rating over on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You can share it with a friend, watch us over on YouTube, but please know that we love having you here. And when you share it, it allows more people to benefit from the great wisdom that our guests bring us each and every podcast episode. So until then, I will see y'all next time.
I just remember thinking, this is crazy. Like my daughter died yesterday. My daughter is dying today. Like, this is the worst thing I've ever been through. And having this baby close to me, whatever magic is happening, skin to skin, is like, I remember thinking, I'm crazy. This is the happiest I've ever been.